The dust hadn't settled from the latest failed attempt when Thunder reared again, his massive hooves pawing the air like weapons against heaven itself. The stallion's eyes blazed with a fire that had burned for 10 years. 10 years of rejecting every soul who dared climb upon his back. Spectators pressed against the weathered fence of Millbrook Ranch, their faces a mixture of anticipation and dread. Another rider lay sprawled in the dirt, hat askew, pride shattered like autumn leaves. Thunder snorted, his breath creating small clouds in the crisp morning air, as if dismissing the very notion that any human could claim dominion over his spirit. "That's the 37th this year," muttered ranch owner Ezra Hutchinson, his calloused hands gripping the fence rail until his knuckles turned white. The number haunted him, not just 37 this year, but hundreds over the decade. Professional bronc riders, horse whisperers, even a circus performer from back east had tried and failed to master the magnificent beast. Thunder stood 17 hands high, his coat the color of midnight storms, muscles rippling beneath skin that had never known a bridle's constraint for more than moments. He'd arrived at the ranch as a 3-year-old, wild caught from the Montana plains, his spirit unbroken despite the journey. What started as a routine breaking had become legend. The stallion had a peculiar method to his madness. He didn't simply buck and thrash like other wild horses. Instead, Thunder seemed to study each rider, learning their weaknesses with an intelligence that unnerved even seasoned horsemen. He would wait, sometimes allowing the rider to settle into false confidence before unleashing a calculated fury that sent them flying with surgical precision. Word had spread across 3 counties about the horse that couldn't be ridden. Prize money grew with each failed attempt, now reaching $15,000 for anyone who could stay mounted for 8 seconds. The money had drawn fortune seekers, daredevils, and professionals alike, but Thunder's record remained unblemished. Local. Veterinarian Dr. Millicent Carver insisted the horse wasn't mean-spirited. "There's no malice in his eyes," she'd observed after treating countless bruised egos and bodies. "It's something deeper, like he's waiting for something or someone." The latest challenger, a cocky young rider named Boone Phillips from Texas, limped toward the gate, his swagger notably absent. "That ain't no ordinary horse," he muttered, spitting dust. "That's the devil himself wearing horsehide." Thunder trotted to the center of the corral, his movements graceful despite his size. He turned his magnificent head toward the crowd, those dark eyes seeming to issue a challenge to anyone brave enough to meet his gaze. The afternoon sun caught the lighter strands in his mane, creating an almost ethereal glow around the creature that had become both attraction and enigma. Children pressed their faces between fence boards, wide-eyed with wonder and fear. Parents pulled them back instinctively, though Thunder had never harmed anyone beyond the standard bumps and bruises that came with being thrown. His violence was precise, calculated, just enough to send the message that he remained unconquered. As shadows began to lengthen across the corral, Ezra prepared to call it another day. The crowd would disperse, nursing their disappointment and planning their return for next weekend's show. Thunder would spend another night alone in his domain, master of his own destiny. But something caught the stallion's attention. His ears perked forward, swiveling toward a figure approaching from the distant pasture. The horse's entire demeanor shifted, his head lifting higher, as he focused on the newcomer with an intensity that made the gathering crowd turn to follow his gaze. The man emerged from the morning mist like a specter, moving with the unhurried gait of someone who had learned patience from the earth itself. Barnaby Crenshaw was nobody special to look at. Average height, weathered face, clothes that spoke of honest work rather than rodeo glamour. But Thunder's reaction was anything but ordinary. The stallion didn't rear or snort his usual warnings. Instead, he stood perfectly still, every muscle tense with anticipation rather than aggression. His dark eyes tracked the farmer's approach with laser focus, as if recognizing something the human spectators couldn't perceive. "Who's that?" whispered a woman in the crowd, but no one seemed to know. Barnaby wasn't from these parts, at least not recently. He'd been working the Henderson farm about 20 miles south, hired help who kept to himself, and spoke only when necessary. Ezra Hutchinson squinted at the approaching figure. Something about the man's bearing triggered a memory, not of meeting him, but of watching him. Yes, he'd seen this stranger before, always at the edges of crowds, always watching Thunder with those quiet gray eyes. Never speaking, never trying his luck like the others, just observing with the patience of someone who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. The crowd fell silent as Barnaby reached the fence. He didn't climb over immediately, didn't announce his intentions or boast about his skills. Instead, he simply stood there, hands resting lightly on the top rail, and looked at Thunder. The horse looked back. It was then that people began to notice the subtle signs. Thunder's ears weren't pinned back in warning. They were forward, alert, but not aggressive. His tail wasn't switching with irritation, but hung relaxed. Most remarkably, the stallion took 3 steps toward the fence, closing the distance between himself and the silent farmer. "I'll be damned," breathed Dr. Carver, her veterinary instincts recognizing something unprecedented in the horse's body language. Barnaby finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying across the hushed corral. "Been watching you, Thunder. Been waiting for the right time." The horse's ears twitched at the sound of his name, spoken without challenge or dominance, simply as acknowledgement. The farmer's movements were deliberate as he climbed the fence. No swagger, no showboating for the crowd. His boots touched the ground inside the corral with the same quiet authority he'd shown approaching. Thunder didn't move away, didn't issue his usual warnings. Instead, he remained statue still, watching. Young, Boone Phillips, still nursing his bruises from the previous day, scoffed from the crowd. "What's he gonna do different? Horse don't care if you're quiet or loud, he throws 'em all the same." But Thunder was already proving him wrong. As Barnaby walked toward the center of the corral, the stallion moved too. Not away, but in a slow circle that kept them facing each other, like dancers learning each other's rhythm. There were no sudden movements, no tests of dominance. Just 2 beings sharing space with mutual respect. The crowd held its collective breath as Barnaby extended his hand, palm open. Thunder stretched his neck forward, nostrils flaring as he caught the farmer's scent. The moment stretched like taffy, tension building not from fear but from anticipation. When Thunder's velvet muzzle touched Barnaby's palm, a ripple of amazement swept through the spectators. The horse that had terrorized riders for a decade was nuzzling this stranger's hand like a family pet greeting its master after a long day. "How's he doing that?" someone whispered, but Barnaby either didn't hear or chose not to answer. His attention remained entirely focused on Thunder, his other hand slowly rising to stroke the stallion's neck. The horse leaned into the touch, eyes half closing in what could only be described as contentment. Ezra found himself leaning forward, hardly believing what he was witnessing. In 10 years, no one had gotten close enough to touch Thunder without being immediately bucked off or bitten. Yet here was this quiet farmer, running his hands along the horse's neck and shoulders, as if they were old friends reuniting. The transformation in Thunder was remarkable. Gone was the wild-eyed defiance, replaced by something approaching serenity. His breathing had slowed, his stance relaxed. When Barnaby moved to his side, the horse didn't flinch or shy away. Instead, he turned his head to keep the farmer in sight. But it was the movement of curiosity rather than wariness. "He's not even using a rope," Dr. Carver observed, her professional fascination overriding her amazement. "No halter, no restraints. The horse is choosing to stay." What happened next defied everything the crowd thought they knew about horses and humans. Barnaby placed both hands on Thunder's back, just behind the withers, and the stallion's only response was to shift his weight slightly, accommodating the touch. No explosion of fury, no violent rejection, just acceptance. The farmer's movements were fluid, unhurried. He spoke to Thunder in words too quiet for the spectators to hear, but the horse's ears swiveled constantly toward the sound, as if every syllable held meaning. Slowly, deliberately, Barnaby began to apply pressure with his hands, testing the stallion's response to weight. Thunder's skin twitched once, twice, then settled. His head remained high but alert rather than alarmed. Whatever conversation was passing between man and horse was conducted in a language older than words, built on trust that hadn't existed moments before. "Sweet mercy," breathed Ezra, watching, something he'd never expected to see. How long's he been planning this? The answer came from an unexpected source. Old Jeremiah Stone, who'd been ranching in these parts for 60 years, shuffled forward through the crowd. His rheumy eyes were fixed on Barnaby with recognition dawning slowly across his weathered features. "I know who that is," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying despite its frailty. "That's Barnaby Crenshaw. Used to run horses up north before the accident. Lost everything when his wife died. Ain't touched a horse since." The revelation rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. A horse trainer, retired by tragedy, now standing beside the most dangerous stallion in 3 counties. But there was more to Jeremiah's story, written in the lines of his face as memory served up painful truths. His wife, she had a way with the wild ones. Could gentle any horse no matter how rank. Barnaby learned from her, but after she passed, the old man's voice trailed off, leaving the crowd to fill in the blanks. In the corral, Barnaby had progressed to leaning his full weight against Thunder's side. The horse's muscles remained relaxed, his breathing steady. What had taken other riders months of preparation, Barnaby was accomplishing in minutes through some invisible connection that transcended technique. Dr. Carver found herself taking notes on her phone, documenting behavior she'd never witnessed. "Look at the horse's posture," she murmured to no one in particular. "He's not submitting, he's participating. There's a difference." Thunder's participation became even more evident when Barnaby stepped back and walked to the horse's head. The stallion lowered his massive skull until his forehead touched the farmer's chest, a gesture of trust so profound that several spectators gasped aloud. For 10 years, Thunder had refused even the gentlest approaches, yet here he was, initiating contact with a stranger. But Barnaby wasn't a stranger, the crowd was beginning to realize. The way he moved around Thunder, the way the horse responded, this wasn't their first meeting. Somewhere, somehow, these two had found each other long before this public moment. The farmer's hands came up to cup Thunder's face, thumbs stroking the soft skin beneath the stallion's eyes. Horse and man stood locked in their private communion while the world watched, barely breathing. Whatever pain Barnaby carried from his past seemed to flow through his touch, meeting and mingling with Thunder's decade of isolation. "They're healing each other," Dr. Carver whispered, her clinical detachment momentarily abandoned. "The horse has been waiting, not for a rider, for a partner." As if responding to her words, Thunder stepped sideways, positioning himself parallel to Barnaby. The movement was deliberate, practiced, as if they'd done this dance before. The stallion's back seemed to lower slightly, his legs spreading to create the perfect mounting platform. The crowd held its breath as Barnaby placed his hands on Thunder's back again. This time, there was no hesitation, no testing. In one fluid motion, the farmer swung his leg over the stallion's broad back and settled into position. Thunder didn't even flinch. 10 years of failed attempts, and now this quiet man sat astride the unconquerable horse, as naturally as settling into a favorite chair. Thunder's head came up, ears pricked forward, but his stance remained calm. If anything, he seemed to stand taller, prouder, with his chosen rider finally in place. The silence stretched until young Boone Phillips broke it with a strangled whisper. "How in the hell?" But the real miracle was yet to come. Thunder's first step forward sent a collective shiver through the watching crowd, not because of violence or rebellion, but because of the profound grace in that simple movement. The stallion, who had spent 10 years fighting every attempt at control, now moved with his rider, as if they shared a single mind. Barnaby's posture was unlike any rider who had attempted to mount Thunder. He didn't grip with his legs or clutch at the horse's mane. Instead, he sat deep and relaxed, his hands resting lightly on Thunder's neck, moving with the rhythm of the horse's powerful stride. There was no battle for dominance, no struggle for control, just partnership in its purest form. Thunder's gait was smooth as silk, each step deliberate and measured. His head was high but not tense, ears constantly moving as he listened to the subtle shifts in Barnaby's weight and breathing. The horse who had been deemed unrideable was now demonstrating why he had rejected every previous attempt. He had been waiting for someone who understood that riding wasn't about conquest, but about conversation. The crowd watched in stunned silence as horse and rider moved through the corral in perfect harmony. Barnaby's legs hung long and loose, his hands never pulling or demanding. Instead, he seemed to ask questions with his body that Thunder answered with fluid changes of direction and pace. It was horsemanship elevated to an art form. "Look at his ears," Dr. Carver whispered to Ezra, who stood transfixed beside her. "The horse is listening to every breath, every heartbeat. They're not fighting, they're dancing." Indeed, what unfolded in the dusty corral resembled nothing so much as an ancient dance, performed by partners who had somehow learned each other's steps without practice. Thunder's movements became more animated, his natural athleticism finally given proper expression. He pranced and pivoted, showing off for his audience while remaining perfectly attuned to the man on his back. Barnaby's face had transformed as well. The quiet sorrow that had marked his features softened into something approaching peace. His eyes were bright with unshed tears, but they were tears of joy rather than grief. For the first time in years, he was doing what he was born to do, communicating with a horse in the language they both understood. The spectators began to murmur as the pair's performance continued. Thunder moved from a walk to a flowing trot, his hooves beating out a rhythm that seemed to echo the farmer's heartbeat. Barnaby rose and fell with the motion, not posting in the traditional sense, but somehow becoming part of the horse's natural cadence. 37 riders this year," Ezra said softly, shaking his head in wonder. "Professional bronc riders, some of the best in the business. And this quiet farmer just climbed on like he was mounting a plow horse." Old Jeremiah Stone nodded knowingly. "That's because he ain't trying to break Thunder. He's trying to understand him. There's a world of difference." As if to prove the point, Thunder suddenly stopped in the center of the corral and turned his head to look back at Barnaby. The exchange that passed between them was wordless, but profound. The horse's eyes held a question, and Barnaby's slight nod provided the answer. What happened next made the crowd gasp in collective amazement. Thunder reared, not in rebellion, but in celebration. His front hooves pawed the air as he had done so many times before, but now there was joy in the gesture rather than defiance. Barnaby rode the movement like a wave, his body flowing with Thunder's motion, never fighting or resisting. When Thunder's hooves touched earth again, he immediately transitioned into a smooth lope. The gait was ground-covering and powerful, but Barnaby sat it easily, his hands still light on the horse's neck. They moved as one being, horse and rider united in purpose and understanding. The lope became a canter, then briefly a gallop as Thunder stretched his legs and really moved out. Dust kicked up behind them, but Barnaby never wavered in the saddle. His face was radiant with pure joy, the expression of a man who had found his way home after years of wandering in the wilderness. When they finally slowed to a walk and then stopped, the silence was deafening. Thunder stood quietly, his breathing elevated but controlled. Sweat darkened his coat, but his eyes were bright with satisfaction. This was what he had been waiting for. Not submission, but partnership. Not conquest, but conversation. Barnaby dismounted as quietly as he had mounted, his feet touching the ground with barely a whisper. Thunder immediately turned toward him, lowering his head until their foreheads touched once again. The gesture was tender, intimate, a private moment of connection witnessed by dozens but belonging only to them. The crowd erupted into applause, but it felt almost sacrilegious to break the spell with noise. What they had witnessed transcended entertainment or competition. It was a demonstration of the bond that could exist between human and horse when both approached each other with respect and understanding. As the applause died down, Barnaby stood beside Thunder, his hand resting on the stallion's neck as if he couldn't bear to break the connection. The transformation in both man and horse was so complete that spectators rubbed their eyes, wondering if they had witnessed something real or supernatural. Dr. Carver was the first to approach the fence separating the crowd from the miracle in the corral. Her veterinary training demanded answers to what she had just observed. "Mr. Crenshaw," she called softly, not wanting to break the spell between horse and rider. "How long have you been working with Thunder?" Barnaby looked up, his eyes still bright with the wonder of the ride. For a moment it seemed he might not answer, but then he spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed afternoon air. 3 months, he said simply. "Been coming here before dawn, after all the crowds went home. Thunder and I, we needed time to get acquainted without all the noise and expectations." The revelation sent murmurs through the crowd. While dozens of riders had attempted to conquer Thunder in daylight spectacles, this quiet farmer had been building a relationship in the pre-dawn darkness, one patient moment at a time. Ezra Hutchinson felt his knees go weak. "You've been on my property without permission?" His voice held more wonder than anger. Barnaby nodded, accepting whatever consequences might come. "Couldn't ask, couldn't explain. You wouldn't have understood until you saw it yourself. Thunder's been calling to me for months, and I finally had to answer." Old Jeremiah Stone shuffled closer to the fence, his ancient eyes sharp with recognition. "You said your wife had a way with horses? She ever work with one like Thunder?" Pain flickered across Barnaby's features, but he didn't flinch from the question. "Lydia had a gift," he said, his voice soft with memory. "She could see into their hearts, understand what they needed. Before she died, she made me promise something." He paused, his hand stroking Thunder's neck. "She made me promise not to let the gift die with her." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. Thunder's decade of resistance hadn't been random wildness. It had been waiting for someone who understood that true horsemanship wasn't about dominance, but about communication, not about breaking, but about partnership. "How did you know?" asked Dr. Carver, her scientific mind struggling to process what seemed impossible. "How did you know Thunder would accept you?" Barnaby smiled for the first time since arriving at the corral. "I didn't know, but I believed. Lydia always said horses choose their partners, not the other way around. Thunder's been choosing all along, choosing to wait for someone who would listen instead of demand." Thunder seemed to sense the emotional weight of the conversation. He moved closer to Barnaby, his massive head coming to rest against the farmer's shoulder. The gesture was protective, comforting, as if the horse understood his human partner's pain and wanted to ease it. Young Boone Phillips, still smarting from his failed attempt the day before, called out from the crowd. "So what now? You gonna train him, sell him, put him in shows?" The question seemed to offend both horse and rider. Thunder's ears pinned back slightly, and Barnaby's expression hardened. "Thunder's not for sale, son. Never has been, never will be. He's got his own mind, his own spirit. I'm just honored he chose to share it with me." Ezra Hutchinson found himself in an impossible position. For 10 years, Thunder had been his prize attraction, drawing crowds and prize money from across the region. But what he had witnessed today transcended commerce. The bond between Barnaby and Thunder was sacred, something that couldn't be bought or sold. "The $15,000, Ezra said slowly. "It's yours if you want it. You stayed on 8 seconds and then some." Barnaby shook his head. "Keep your money. This isn't about winning or losing. This is about understanding." He looked around at the crowd, his gaze taking in every face. Thunder doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. Anymore, neither do I. Dr. Carver stepped forward, her professional curiosity overriding social conventions. Would you be willing to work with other difficult horses? There are animals that could benefit from your approach." For the first time, Barnaby hesitated. Thunder sensed his uncertainty and nuzzled his shoulder encouragingly. The horse that had rejected everyone else was now offering his own form of guidance to the man who had understood him. "Maybe," Barnaby said finally. "But only if they're ready, only if they choose. I won't force partnership on any creature that isn't willing to give it freely." The crowd began to disperse as the afternoon shadows lengthened, but many lingered, reluctant to leave the scene of such an extraordinary event. They had come expecting entertainment, and had witnessed something approaching the miraculous, proof that patience, understanding, and respect could overcome any barrier. Thunder remained close to Barnaby, as if making it clear that their partnership extended beyond the single ride. Whatever the future held, these two had found in each other something that both had been missing. The horse, a true partner who understood his spirit, and the man, a purpose that honored his late wife's memory while healing his own wounded heart. 6. Months later, Millbrook Ranch had transformed from a spectacle ground into something approaching sanctuary. The arena where Thunder had thrown dozens of riders now served as a training ground for a different kind of horsemanship, one built on trust rather than dominance, understanding rather than conquest. Barnaby had accepted Ezra's offer to stay, on as head trainer, but only under specific conditions. No more exhibitions, no more crowds gathering to watch horses being broken. Instead, the ranch had become a place where problem horses came to find their voices, and where their humans learned to listen. Thunder remained the heart of the operation, no longer the star attraction, but the wise teacher. His transformation, from defiant stallion to gentle mentor, amazed everyone who witnessed it. He seemed to understand his new role instinctively, offering patience to frightened horses and guidance to confused humans. Dr. Carver had documented the changes not just in Thunder, but in every horse that came through Barnaby's program. Traditional breaking methods were abandoned in favor of communication techniques that honored each animal's individual spirit. The success rate was unprecedented, not because the horses were conquered, but because they chose to participate. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the maple trees in shades of gold and crimson, a new challenge arrived at Millbrook Ranch. A young mare named Celeste, traumatized by harsh handling, trembled in the trailer that brought her. Her owners had tried everything, but the horse had shut down completely, refusing to trust any human touch. Barnaby approached the trailer slowly, Thunder walking beside him like a partner rather than a mount. The stallion's presence had become essential to the healing process. Other horses seemed to recognize his wisdom and drew comfort from his calm energy. "Easy, girl," Barnaby murmured as Celeste backed to the far corner of the trailer. "Nobody's going to hurt you here. Thunder and we understand what it's like to carry pain." It took 3 hours to coax Celeste from the trailer, but when she finally emerged, it was to walk directly to Thunder. The big stallion lowered his head to touch noses with the frightened mare, and something passed between them that transcended species, recognition of shared experience perhaps, or simply the comfort of understanding. Ezra watched from the fence, still amazed by what his ranch had become. The prize money and crowds were gone, but something far more valuable had taken their place. Letters arrived daily from horse owners whose animals had been transformed by Barnaby's methods. Veterinarians referred cases they had given up hope of solving. Most importantly, the horses themselves seemed to spread the word. Traumatized animals arrived stressed and left with dignity restored. "You know," Ezra said to Dr. Carver, who had become a regular observer and documenter of the ranch's methods, "I thought I was in the entertainment business. Turns out I was really in the healing business all along." Thunder's influence extended beyond the ranch boundaries. Videos of his transformation with Barnaby had spread across social media, but rather than attracting thrill seekers, they drew people genuinely interested in learning new approaches to horse-human relationships. Training programs based on Barnaby's methods were being adopted at ranches across the country. The farmer himself had changed as much as his horses. The quiet sorrow that had marked his features for years had been replaced by purposeful contentment. He spoke of Lydia often now, sharing her wisdom with students who came to learn. Her memory lived on not in grief, but in the gentle transformation of every horse that found its voice under his guidance. Thunder had become something of a legend, but not for his ability to throw riders. Stories spread of the horse who chose his own partner, who waited 10 years for someone who would listen rather than demand. Children drew pictures of him, writers crafted stories about him, and horsemen across the country spoke his name with reverence. As evening approached, Barnaby led Thunder to the pasture where the stallion would spend the night. But before turning him loose, the farmer paused for their daily ritual. He pressed his forehead against Thunder's, and for a moment the two stood in perfect communion. "Thank you," Barnaby whispered, as he did every evening, "for waiting, for choosing me, for showing me the way back." Thunder's response was barely perceptible, a soft nicker that seemed to say he understood, that the choice had been mutual, that the healing had flowed both ways. As the stars emerged overhead, Thunder grazed peacefully in his pasture, no longer the defiant stallion who had terrorized riders but not yet fully tamed either. He remained wild at heart, but it was a wildness tempered by partnership, a spirit that had found its perfect complement in a grieving farmer who had learned to listen. The story of the horse who refused every rider for 10 years had become something greater, a testament to the power of patience, the miracle of understanding, and the truth that sometimes the greatest victories come not from conquest, but from connection. In finding each other, Thunder and Barnaby had discovered something precious, that healing, like partnership, works best when it flows both ways. At Millbrook Ranch, under the vast Montana sky, the legend continued to grow, not of a horse that couldn't be ridden, but of a partnership that proved love and understanding could overcome any barrier, heal any wound, and transform any heart willing to remain open to possibility.